Everybody. Thank you for joining us today to learn about environment, health, and environmental justice impacts of combined sewer overflows and related legislation, House Bill 866, which will have a hearing before the Environment Committee on October 25th next week. I am Jen Ryan with the Charles River Watershed Association, and today you'll be hearing from the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, BU School of Public Health, Save the Alewife Brook, Charles River Watershed Association, and Mystic River Watershed Association. As we have about 200 people registered for this event, it's very popular, participants will be on mute and questions should be asked in the chat. We'll save time at the end of the hour for Q&A after the presenters finish. And with that, I would like to introduce Catherine Lang from the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance. Catherine will be providing an overview of CSOs in the state and the CSO notification system.
All right, are we live? Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. Thank you for coming this morning. Just briefly, if you haven't heard of Mass Rivers, we are a statewide organization with 85 member groups dedicated to protecting and restoring the rivers and streams of the Commonwealth. Some of the folks on this call are already a part of our member groups, so we're grateful to be with them today and be with all of you. Across the Commonwealth, we are blessed with beautiful, charming, old, colonial urban centers. It's part of the character of where we live, but unfortunately with those beautiful old centers comes much less charming water infrastructure that was oftentimes built in the late 1800s, the 1900s, systems that were built for an earlier time and are unequipped to meet the demands of today, both of our population and of our new climate needs. Our water infrastructure was built before we had the data we do about climate change, and it's certainly not equipped for the new rain trends that we're seeing and certainly saw this summer. We're talking today all about sewage pollution, and particularly combined sewers, and we're talking about combined sewage and stormwater in one pipe. So as we talk about the impacts of sewage, know that the shadow behind it is stormwater pollution, which is considered to be the top threat to water quality in our state. So we have two problems to our rivers that are combined oftentimes into one pipe. If you're unfamiliar with combined sewers, on a typical day, like today, I see blue skies. They work like on the left. There's one pipe that carries the sewage from our homes and businesses to the wastewater treatment plant, where it is cleaned before being released back into waterways. But on a wet day, that pipe is joined by the rain from the street as well as snow melt. All of that water goes into the pipe, which is only so big, can only carry so much to the wastewater treatment plant. So by design, to avoid backups into people's homes, to protect the treatment plant from getting clogged up, these combined sewers were designed to overflow some of that rain sewage mixture into a nearby river or stream. And this does prevent some of those backups, which is good, but we are left with untreated sewage in our rivers and streams. In 2023, this continues to happen, unfortunately. This is a problem for several reasons that my colleagues will go over in greater detail in this briefing, but you should walk away knowing it's a problem for environmental justice as they are concentrated in our urban centers. It's a problem for public health because, unsurprisingly, if you come to contact with water that has fecal contamination, that can cause an array of problems for your body. And of course, it's a climate change problem. Not one you think of as being a climate change impact, but as climate change escalates, as our precipitation trends grow more intense, as our rains become flashier, with that comes more sewage pollution because, again, our water infrastructure was not built for these new trends that we're experiencing. It can only carry so much water at a time. So unfortunately, sewage pollution is occurring more frequently with the more rain that we're experiencing. And I'll note that the picture on the right is from the city of Cambridge during a flood a few years ago. So it's all wrapped up into one sewage pipe. The last time many of you may have heard about this problem was during advocacy for the sewage notification law. Many of us on this call advocated for this for many years. It was finally signed into law in early 2021 by Governor Charlie Baker. It went into effect on the ground July of last summer. So we've had just over a year of this program being into effect. We've been able to see how it's been working, ways it could be improved, but most importantly, word is getting out that combined sewer overflows exist and that these overflow events are happening in our communities. The law requires sewer operators to have a notification system so that you or me or anybody can sign up for email and or text alerts to know when and where these overflows are happening. That way you can make an informed choice on how you might want to engage with your waterway, because it's advised that to avoid contact with these waters 48 hours after a discharge has occurred. In addition to that notification system, there also were requirements for those alerts to be translated into relevant languages for the communities that they serve, as well as going to many news outlets, including those in those relevant different languages. And there also are physical sign requirements at the discharge points themselves, like this green sign in Springfield, but also signs downstream of the overflow points. So if you are hanging out by your local river, if you don't know about this system, hopefully you can find out information about how your sewers work and about your local water quality at that river access point. One huge benefit of this program has been that sewer operators now are required to track exactly when, where, and how much sewer discharge is coming out of their systems. Before this law, we had estimates. Some operators were tracking these overflows better than others, but now the data is all collected into one data portal that my colleague Max will talk about later. But this is online. It's public through EEA. I encourage you to check it out later. You can filter by where you live or by date, so you can see exactly when and where this is happening. And I want to convey that this sewer discharges don't just happen during really intense rainstorms. They happen almost every time it rains. If you're putting on a raincoat to go out for errands, more than likely a discharge is occurring somewhere in the system. And we saw that certainly this summer. We had record amounts of rain, which unfortunately also meant record amounts of sewage pollution. Headlines like these were common this summer and last summer too, when the program went into effect. People are finding out for the first time that this happens and that no, it's not a fluke. It's not your sewer system making a mistake or misfiring. This is, in fact, by design. This is how it's made to work. So as people are finding out that that's how the systems run, they're getting freaked out, and rightfully so. This is a really disgusting and terrifying problem that we still are experiencing in 2023. So all of this news coverage and unfortunately the beach closures that went along with it have been horrible for recreation, for public health, but have at least increased awareness and interest in upgrading our water infrastructure. So you'll hear a lot from us today on this briefing about this problem, but I want to convey that there are many different ways to get at this problem, including funding. These are notoriously very expensive to implement. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We need to increase funding through our existing avenues like the Clean Water Trust, like federal grants. We have a bill right now pending with the State House that would require the MWRA to shut down some of their CSOs. Increasingly, we need to raise political will and public awareness so people care about this issue. Most folks don't think about their sewers until something's wrong. So getting folks to understand this is a problem is a great first step. And then, of course, each of the permittees that has CSOs has a long-term plan. In those plans, there's opportunity for public comment to advocate for the abatement and mitigation of this problem. So advocates are firing on all fronts to get rid of this problem once and for all. We're glad you're here to hear about some of these ways in more detail.
Super. Thank you very much, Catherine. And as a reminder to everyone, we're going to do a Q&A after the speakers. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And I would like to introduce now Dr. Beth Haley. It's our pleasure to have her here with us today. She's from the BU School of Public Health, and we'll be discussing health impacts of CSOs with a focus on the Merrimack River. Dr. Beth Haley.
Great, thank you so much. Hello, my name is Dr. Beth Haley from the Boston University School of Public Health, and I'm here to share what is known about the health risks associated with CSO releases. In the past few years, an increasing number of well-conducted scientific studies have shown that CSO releases are associated with increased rates of illness in people living near CSO locations. CSO releases contain untreated and partially treated sewage that can contain bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, many of which are pathogenic, meaning that they can make people sick. The releases also contain some toxic chemicals. People can be in contact with these pathogens and chemicals while swimming, wading, fishing, or kayaking downstream of overflow sites, or potentially by drinking water drawn from the CSO impacted water body if it has not been adequately purified. Along with colleagues, Dr. Heiger Bernays and I just completed a study that examines the impacts of CSO discharges in the Merrimack River in northern Massachusetts and New Hampshire on acute gastrointestinal illness in the Massachusetts municipalities that border the river. We found that large volumes of CSO discharges are associated with a significant increase in the risk of developing gastrointestinal illness in people living in those downstream municipalities. Although some municipalities bordering the Merrimack River exclusively get their drinking water from the river, we did not see meaningful differences in risk of gastrointestinal illness in these communities compared to those that don't rely on the Merrimack River for their drinking water. In conclusion, there are health risks of CSO discharges, and as precipitation increases due to climate change, these discharges are increasing in magnitude and frequency, and our methods to study and document the health risks associated with them are improving. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And also note that your colleague, Dr. Heiger Bernays, is also with us to answer questions at the end of the presentations. And with that, I will turn it over now to Jean Benson and Kirsten Anderson from Save the Alewife Brook, the leaders on this important legislation representing a brook and surrounds severely impacted by CSOs. Jean and Kirsten. Jean, you're muted still.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Jen mentioned, Kristen Anderson and I are here from Save the Alewife Brook. Kristen is one of the founders of Save the Alewife Brook, a pretty new organization that was founded because Alewife Brook is plagued by CSO overflows, flooding, and other pollution. And I'm here today to talk about House Bill 886, an act relative to combined sewer overflows, a sensible, achievable, and necessary response to raw sewage being dumped in our waterways through CSOs. Oops. So 38 years after the legislature created the MWRA to end the dumping of sewage and sludge into Boston Harbor, and 25 years after the Deer Island treatment plant started treating the region's sewage to end Boston Harbor pollution, dumping of untreated sewage continues. 50 CSOs, that's 50, discharge many hundreds of millions of gallons of sewage, which is human and industrial waste, annually into Boston's area, rivers, streams, brooks, water channels, and Boston Harbor. 5 of those 50 CSOs were engineered to dump untreated sewage only in greater than 25-year size storms. The other 45 dump sewage into our waterways in smaller storms. 5 of those 50 have minimal treatment to remove some solids and deactivate bacteria. It's not the type of treatment you get at the Deer Island treatment plant. It's very minimal treatment. 40 CSOs dump untreated human and industrial wastes in larger and smaller storms without any treatment whatsoever. How much CSO sewage is dumped? The discharges vary by year depending on storm amounts and intensities. In an average year, if you could define that, 414 million gallons of sewage is dumped in our waterways through CSOs. In 2021, more than 1 billion gallons of CSO sewage was dumped into our waterways, and I've highlighted here the ones that were untreated, no treatment whatsoever, raw sewage, over 50 million gallons untreated into Alewife Brook, over 9 million gallons untreated where the Mystic and Chelsea rivers come together, over 22 million gallons untreated in the upper inner harbor, over 18 million gallons untreated in the lower inner harbor, over 52 million gallons untreated into Fort Point Channel, over 1 million gallons untreated into Reserve Channel, over 11 million gallons untreated into the Upper Charles, over 20 million gallons untreated into the Lower Charles, and over 5 million gallons untreated into the Back Bay Fens. And that's just untreated. If you take the partially treated ones too, you get to over a billion gallons in 2021 of untreated. We don't have the data, obviously, from 2023 because the year is not over yet, but it will probably be a similar horrible amount. The problem with raw untreated sewage, and some of this you've heard and you'll hear some more, many CSOs are in environmental justice neighborhoods. Public health officials have recommended avoiding contact with CSO receiving waters during rainstorms and for 48 hours afterward due to increased public health risks. The CSO waters have bacteria, pollutants, as you heard before, things that are very bad for your health. Alewife Brook, which we're talking about, which is a small stream that borders Arlington, Cambridge, and Somerville, sewage laden with CSOs has overflowed into people's homes. Kristen will talk about that. It regularly overflows into the Alewife Greenway, a well-used public path in the DCR Alewife Reservation. And as I'm sure you know, CSOs harm wildlife, have noxious odors, degrade the environment, and reduce our ability to enjoy our parks, rivers, and streams. Will federal law fix the CSO problem? No. Federal law allows CSOs to continue to dump raw, untreated sewage. There are really 3 reasons why the federal law doesn't work and will not end CSO dumping. One is the typical year problem. They just have to figure out what the typical year is and then reduce but not eliminate their discharges in a typical year. And as you might imagine, where climate change is getting worse and the typical year doesn't really reflect what happens in many of our years when we have storms that are greater than a typical year. The 9 minimum controls problem is that if they work on 9 minimum controls, they don't really need to end CSO discharges. And there is no treatment requirement or time limit mandate in the federal law to do this. We've had some conversations with MWRA, and it's told us it has no intention to go beyond what is minimally required by federal law. We've heard no different from the other CSO entities in the MWRA area that they have any intention of ending their sewer CSO discharges. They've made some steps. They've gotten the low-hanging fruit, but they've basically plateaued. H886 will address the CSO mess head-on. It's a realistic, outcome-oriented, and consistent with current technologies and procedures. It recognizes that some CSOs may need to be available in large storms to prevent sewer backups for some time. So this legislation requires that in 10 years, not immediately, in 10 years, each of the CSOs then in the MWRA sewer service area must either have the treatment now provided at 5 CSOs or only activate during 25-year or larger storms and not during smaller storms, as is now the case for 5 CSOs along Dorchester Bay. This is not the end CSO forever, but this is the next important step in moving this forward, a step that you can't find anywhere else. 10 years is an adequate amount of time to do more sewer separation, one thing that needs to be done. Incorporate more green stormwater infrastructure, such as rain gardens. They weren't really thought of when the federal CSO law was in place. Close more CSOs and plan, permit, and implement the necessary engineering fixes. So this is a 10-year timeline, realistic, outcome-oriented, and can be done with current technologies and procedures. Now is the time for the legislature to act. There's no federal preemption. states can be more protective of their environment and their residents than required by the Federal Clean Water Act. States can hold themselves and their entities, cities, authorities, etc., to higher standards than federal requirements. And we know more about the terrible impacts of CSOs on public health and on environmental justice populations. Together, we can address this unfinished business of the Boston Harbor cleanup. So we urge everyone to support and help work for this legislation. I'm now going to turn this over to Kristen Anderson, one of the founders of the Save the Alewife Brook, to give some more information about impacts on the brook. Kristen?
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Good morning. My name is Kristen Anderson, and I'm from Save the Alewife Brook. The Alewife Brook has occupied my home. During 2 flood events, untreated and contaminated sewage floodwater spilled over the banks of the brook. It flooded into the park in my backyard and came into my house right through the back door. My neighbors had no idea of the health hazards associated with exposure to the floodwater. We waded through that untreated sewage floodwater in our homes. My neighbors and I got sick following exposure to the Alewife floodwater. We experienced flu-like symptoms with intestinal distress, including bloody diarrhea. And it wasn't until a FEMA representative explained what was in the water that we became aware of the CSOs. It's important to realize that we live in a very densely populated area. The Alewife serves as a border between Cambridge, Somerville, Arlington, and is near Belmont and Medford. There are 5,000 people living in the Alewife's 100-year floodplain. The Alewife runs through what was once called the Great Swamp, where 90% of the original wetlands have been developed. It is very close to sea level, it is flashy, and it is flood prone. It is said that that dilution is the solution to pollution, but the Alewife is a very small water body, channelized for much of its 1.6 mile length. It is approximately 20 feet wide and 1 foot deep. The Alewife Brook is a very small water body when compared to the Boston Harbor, the Channel, the Charles River, or the Mystic River. So there is comparatively more pollution in the Alewife Brook. This year, in 2023, we experienced 2 Alewife Brook flood events on August 8th and on September 18th. On August 8th alone, 5 of the 6 Alewife CSOs discharged 8.77 million gallons of untreated sewage pollution into our little brook. That day, the brook overflowed its banks, sending contaminated floodwater into the heavily used Alewife Greenway. This commuter path provides area residents access to the Alewife Red Line T to and from Medford, Somerville, Arlington, and Cambridge. You can see here a photo of residents. This picture was shot by Alewife abutter David Stoff of Save the Alewife Brook. Residents were unknowingly running through, walking through, and pushing baby strollers through sewage-contaminated floodwater, untreated sewage-contaminated floodwater at 3 p.m. on August 8th, 2023. On that day, over 8 million gallons of untreated sewage was discharged from the CSOs into the Alewife Brook. People using the path had no idea that the brook is flooding or that there is sewage in that water. They just see puddles in the park. Nobody can believe that this is happening in 2023 in a wealthy first world city. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen and Jean, for those sobering numbers. The amount of untreated sewage is sobering. And this photo of somebody walking through with their baby, I know that path well, is equally as sobering. With that, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Max Rome from the Charles River Watershed Association.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so much great information here. Some of what I say will hopefully reinforce some of these ideas. But the first thing I'm going to do is just give a very high-level overview of what the state of combined sewer overflow and sanitary sewer overflow looks like in Massachusetts. So, this is kind of a picture of environmental unhealth in the state. that we're able to understand really for the first time this year because of this law requiring centralized reporting of combined sewer overflows. So kind of a couple numbers. In 2023, we have seen over 5.3 billion gallons of combined sewage discharged into state waters. To try and put that number in perspective for those of us who are in the kind of greater Boston area, that's 7 times the volume of Walden Pond. If we think about that volume in terms of the flow of the Charles River, if you can picture yourself standing near the Watertown Dam, that's 27 days of flow coming over the Watertown Dam. Really incredible to think about. 2023, that's this year alone. 2023 is a good year for us to be talking about combined sewer overflow because it's been a wet year, and it's kind of giving us a real test of what this system looks like kind of in our climate future. So I'm going to kind of talk about this, the big statewide picture a little bit more. 5.3 billion gallons, 170 unique outfalls, and over 2,600 events just in this year so far. There are 16 municipalities with CSOs, and there's an additional 17 municipalities that also are dealing with sanitary sewer overflow. And statewide, these overflows are concentrated in a couple different locations. And I'm going to zoom around on this map, and we'll take a look at them. One are kind of Chicopee, Holyoke, Springfield along the Connecticut River. And something that we'll see kind of as we pan around this map is where we see a concentration of combined sewer overflows, we also see our state's environmental justice neighborhoods. And that's this layer of yellow, green, and blue census tracts. So that's the Connecticut River. That's a big locus of combined sewer overflow. Another is along the Merrimack River. Many of these towns are discharging not only very, very high volumes of sewage, but also very, very frequently. These are discharges that are happening even with relatively small storms. Fall River and New Bedford each have their own very unique problems. And then, what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit more detail is the picture here in Boston Harbor. Jean showed a great map, and, this is a more colorful, maybe more confusing way to look at it. But outfalls are widespread. They're really active. And in this year alone, we have had more than 62 million gallons of combined sewer overflow into the lower basin, right where people swim, or don't swim, but right where people row and recreate. So hold on a second, I'm going to do a little screen toggling. Are we seeing these slides now? Okay, great. So yeah. I think just a point that we can't hit too many times is the point that the goal for these waters is that they be swimmable and fishable. That's the goal of the Clean Water Act. And in the Charles River specifically, that's a goal that we set in 2005 in 1995 to achieve by 2005. And we're not there yet. There's been incredible progress made on CSO reduction, and we have really reaped the benefits of those investments in improved bacterial water quality. And the Charles River Watershed Association tracks that improved water quality through a letter grade, and you can see that as we've really reduced CSOs, we've kind of gotten to this B+, A- territory, which is where we are now. A little bit more about how these systems work. We've covered this plenty already, but I think the point to make is that water that's coming off of the urban environment is polluted. Water that's coming directly out of your toilet is even more polluted. So this is Not all of the bacterial contamination comes from combined sewer overflow, but it's a significant and important source to address. Jean talked about the typical year, which I think is one of the most confusing concepts in, water quality regulations. But the point that I think we need to make really clearly is that the system that we have now, while it has allowed us to make a lot of progress over decades, it's ensured an environment in which wet years are always going to have a lot of CSO discharge. Dry years can look good, but wet years will always have a lot of discharge. And you can see that in the Charles River in 2022. And in 2020, we had dry years. In 2020, we almost hit the long-term control plan goals. In 2022, we did even better than that. But in 2021, 126 million gallons of sewage into the river. In 2023, and this year, another wet year, as I said, we're already at 62 million gallons just in the lower basin. Something I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is what can we do about this? What are other cities doing about this? There are a range of approaches that we haven't brought to this challenge yet in Massachusetts. Philadelphia is an example of a city that has a really comprehensive approach to deal with combined sewer overflow. Basically, they have mapped the areas that contribute to combined sewers, and they have a goal of treating all of those areas with green infrastructure. So what that means is 85% of the water that falls within a combined sewer area is going to enter the ground, is going to infiltrate into the ground before it can enter a combined sewer pipe and discharge into the rivers. Philadelphia is making really good progress towards these goals. They've met their 10-year goal, and they're kind of on track to meet their long-term goals by 2036 to deal with CSOs through this green infrastructure approach. A second example worth highlighting is from New York City, kind of similar to Philadelphia. New York City has a goal to manage runoff, 10% of all runoff from impervious surfaces through detention and infiltration. This is not an approach that has really been implemented in the Boston area yet. We've looked at sewer separation, we've looked at large detention systems, but there hasn't been a focus yet on distributed infiltration to deal with the water that's falling within the combined sewer areas. Another example is Kansas City. So Kansas City has a long-standing consent decree with the EPA to clean up their act. It's a very expensive plan. What they were looking at was a price tag of about $4.7 billion to meet their long-term control plan goals. They were able to re-examine their plans and come up with a new plan that uses a lot more green infrastructure to reduce the sizing of gray infrastructure and to do a lot of infiltration. On paper, at least, they believe that this plan is going to let them save $2.3 billion and still meet their water quality goals. And I'll say something that's interesting about Kansas City, different from New York, different from Philadelphia. Their plan is very focused on doing larger installations that are retrofits to parks and enhance kind of publicly owned property. But this is the type of best in class planning that we should be doing in Massachusetts, and we're really not quite doing it yet. Another interesting example comes out of California. This is the Long Beach Municipal Urban Stormwater Treatment Plant. So this is a facility, I think, that's a little bit similar to, you can think of it as being kind of similar to Cottage Farm. It's a facility that's at the end of a pipe that gets a ton of stormwater. But instead of just doing chlorination, dechlorination, and dumping it in the river, this facility has a capacity to treat 2 million gallons of water per day. It does some very advanced ceramic ultrafiltration, oxidation, so kind of a much more advanced level of treatment. And then it discharges that water not into the river, but into a constructed wetland where it can enter the river more gradually or potentially be used for irrigation in future phases. So, you know, the takeaway, hopefully from my remarks here, is that CSOs are widespread. They're concentrated in 5 different urban areas in our state. We need to be learning from other cities in terms of how to really tackle this stormwater at the source and not at the end of the pipe. And, you know, we should be a leader in this. And then, you know, finally, I'll just say, if folks are interested in this area in kind of engaging with this process and learning more very specifically about what MWRA and the city of Cambridge and Somerville are doing, on 6 p.m. on November 15th, there is a public meeting where they'll be giving information about this. And I hope that you'll join CRWA in pushing for the use of green infrastructure to both improve our neighborhoods and deal with CSO pollution before it enters the pipe. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Max. A reminder to folks to put your questions in the chat. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A. And finally, our last speakers, Patrick Heron and Nathan Standers from the Mystic River Watershed Association.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me start by introducing Dr. Nathan Sanders, statistician and partner to the Mystic River Watershed Association, has been following combined sewer overflow and been involved in policy for the past decade. So I'm going to let Nathan begin by talking about environmental justice and CSOs.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be part of the conversation today. So I am Nathan Sanders. I'm a data scientist and a researcher at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. And I got introduced to this issue about a decade ago, working as a legislative fellow in Senator Jalen's office. And I've been very glad to work on it with Patrick and the Mystic River Watershed Association over the years since. So I did want to start by centering the topic of environmental justice. As many of you know, our state has a fairly newly adopted environmental justice policy. It defines EJ as the equal protection and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision-making, and it obligates us to have an equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens across our state. So what that means for sewage is that in a just commonwealth that really adopts this EJ policy, your zip code would not determine your exposure to sewage pollution. Whether you live in a rich or a poor community, whether you live around many white people or people of color, would not change whether you are exposed to 0 gallons of sewage or hundreds of millions of gallons. But as we've seen today in Massachusetts, your zip code is your destiny with respect to sewage. So here's a plot that you've seen a few times before. This map is showing watersheds across Massachusetts, along with the locations of combined sewer overflows in green. And because sewage overflows are an urban phenomenon, there's a strong correlation between those watersheds that have high concentrations of environmental justice populations and the locations where CSOs are occurring. If we look at the Mystic in particular, it is among the, of all watersheds in Massachusetts, it's among the highest in all 3 of the statewide environmental justice indicators. It has among the highest fractions of non-white residents, among the highest fraction of residents who are at or near the poverty limit, and among the highest fractions of residents who are linguistically isolated. And in addition, as you've heard, the Mystic watershed, including the Alewife Brook, receives hundreds of millions of gallons of sewage discharge. So as we've discussed today, we do have a valuable new tool in the state to understand the disparate impacts of sewage pollution across environmental justice communities. We have a new statewide notification system that gives us a new window to understand these impacts. And so in just over a year, about 16 months since the notification system came online, nearly 7 billion gallons of total verified sewage discharge have been reported. And we now have access to that data in nearly real time. So my colleagues and I have been comparing those discharge reports to the demographics of populations across the Commonwealth to try and understand what correlation exists between environmental justice community concentrations and sewage discharge. We're looking at relationships like this that compare sewage pollution burden to the demographics of different communities. And to test for disparate impact, what we'd like to see is a trend like this, showing that sewage pollution is low in every community and it's equal, it's flat, regardless of the demographics of your community. But when we look at the real data from the notification system, what we see are results like this. This is showing that if you live in a watershed that has twice the level of linguistic isolation as another watershed, you're not going to have the same level of sewage burden. You're likely to have nearly twice as much sewage discharge in your watershed. And if we look at the other two EJ indicators, the results are even more stark. If you live in a watershed that has twice the level of low-income residents and poverty, you're likely to have more than 3 times the amount of sewage discharge. And finally, if you live in a watershed that has twice the fraction of residents who are people of color, you're likely to have more than 4 times as much sewage discharge in your watershed. So the final thought I'll leave you with is that our environmental justice communities deserve action on this front. We have an obligation to provide an equitable distribution of the burdens of environmental pollution, including sewage discharge, and we can take action to make progress towards that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Patrick.
Good morning again, everybody, and delighted to be the anchor leg here and reinforce the ideas that you've heard about today. And I think I'd like to just start and help people understand that in particular, there's a nexus of issues happening in the Mystic, and in particular at Alewife Brook. That if you remember early in this series of briefings that Dr. Haley described these clear indicators of pathogens that are found in combined sewer overflows, and this regular distribution of health outcomes associated with being in the vicinity of those combined sewer overflows, sometimes in areas that are drinking water sources. We also heard just now from Dr. Sanders, and also in reference in Max's presentation, that the burden of combined sewer overflows is disproportionately put on our poorest, our linguistically isolated, and most vulnerable residents in Massachusetts. So basically, what we're doing is we're concentrating the health impacts on our most vulnerable residents. And Alewife Brook is a nexus of these issues. On the left is Alewife Brook as mapped in the EEA environmental viewer that shows the environmental justice populations around this very small brook. And on the right is a measure by the EPA EJ screen. This is a national database. It's also a mapping system that shows that the exposures that residents experience here at Alewife Brook are among the top 10% in all of the country. And so I think I also want to just take a moment and go back and reference for a moment this really vivid image that Kristen showed at the end of her presentation, which is people walking in combined sewer overflows. And the guidelines that the EPA puts out and the enforcement that happens actually don't even contemplate the situation where combined sewer overflows is actually not in the water, but on the land associated with it. So for folks that are walking or even in their own backyard experiencing that, something needs to be done. So this returns to a graphic, and this just shines a light on the situation in the Mystic and Alewife. That large bar in the middle is MWR 205, and that is the treated discharges that happen near the Amelia Earhart Dam, just below it. And on the far right is the basically overflow to the freshwater section when it's high tide. And combined, you'll see that that's more than 130 million gallons of treated sewage being discharged. The two smaller bars, CAM 401 and Somerville 001, refer to the untreated CSO discharges happening in this very small brook. And they are significant. In fact, since this new reporting system has been in place in about a year, we've had in excess of 15 million gallons of untreated CSOs in this area. And just by way of background, to predict and know when these are happening, they're most associated with not total rainfall, but actually the intensity of the rainfall. So here in black is a measure, it's an index of the rate of rainfall. And then red is the CSO release that happened at that time at CAM 401 in Alewife Brook, and the volumes. And so you can see for single releases, sometimes we'll have volumes in excess of 3 million gallons. This is worth highlighting because right now we're describing a situation where we're having discharges impacting both residents in the near vicinity, but downstream recreational users in current conditions. And we know that the infrastructure that we need to build has to last. It has to be built for the next 50 to 75 years. And we need to be prepared for a wetter, more intense future than is now. So we need significant investment, and we need a significant set of goalposts to hold ourselves accountable. And so for that reason, the Mystic River Watershed Association is in favor of Bill H886 and bringing the sewage discharges down to a controlled level so they're not regularly happening like they are now, and that we're not putting the burden of our undersized infrastructure on our most vulnerable residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, everyone, for those informative and thought-provoking presentations. It was very interesting. I want to remind everybody here that the bill will be heard at the Joint Committee of Environment and Natural Resources on October 25th from 1 to 5. It was filed by Reps Rogers and Maduro. And we have time for Q&A, so I'm going to pop up some questions and read them out to some of our presenters. Okay, first question, does the notification law require common terms to be used when a CSO occurs?
So there's language that is required under the notification law. It says combined sewer overflow, and that is plain to folks who might work in the industry and may be confusing if you haven't heard of that term before. Sewer operators can add in more than just that required language. Some of them have, some of them haven't, but certainly at the signage that's required at public access points, many of those explain what a CSO is and go into greater detail.
Excellent, thank you. The second question is to Beth. It says, thank you, Beth, for the great work. Does your team have any slides you can share showing the results, and in which communities is GI illness a problem during CSO events?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Right now, we're about to publish this study, so it should be available for people to see soon. And in terms of the communities impacted, we were looking at those municipalities that border the Merrimack River in Massachusetts. So that is where our results are relevant to. But right now, there have not been similar studies done in the rest of Massachusetts, but now with the CSO data available.
Thank you. Someone asks, how can we help with passing the state law? What action can be taken by concerned citizens? Again, the hearing is next week. I would encourage you to sign up. You can sign up on the state's website. We'll circulate that information. You can put in testimony, talk to your representatives and senators. And somebody did ask if there was a Senate bill. There is not. It's only on the House side. But talking to your state rep and your state senator and talking to your neighbors and reaching out to the legislature, I think would be very effective, as well as writing letters to the editor, to your local paper, or commenting on your local Facebook group. Let's see. Another question, can anyone point to information, even an overview of what could be done to fix CSOs, how much it would cost? H886 just says, there shall be no by 2035. Can you talk more about realistic solutions on the table? I know Max had talked a little bit about this, so maybe I'll pass this one to Max.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a really hard technical issue, and there's no one size fits all solution because each of these different, sub basins are kind of complicated, and there's different challenges associated with each outfall. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from other communities. Philadelphia, Kansas City, I think have a lot to teach Boston. So that's kind of, that's what I would say. I think that all right, let me say this again in a clear way. There's a lot of correct feelings that green infrastructure can't be the only solution to combined sewer overflow. But I think something that the data shows us really clearly in Massachusetts is that right now we are having combined sewer overflow even when there are storms that are dropping less than an inch of rain. And that's a volume, that's a type of precipitation event that we really can deal with by just following best management practices for stormwater. That's got to be the first step. It's a really important first step. Now, to get to that second step of the 25-year control or even complete elimination of combined sewer overflow, that requires a different approach. That probably requires larger storage, which could be green storage in the form of, wetlands and detention ponds, or it could be gray storage in the form of, really large underground storage chambers. But ultimately, the only way that we eliminate combined sewer overflow is to separate our sewers.
And if I could just add to that, one of the important pieces of H 886 is the recognition of what Max said. What you put in to meet the goals in that law depends on where you are in the MWA system. What Cambridge might do for its CSOs might be different than what Somerville does, and therefore the law does not dictate what each of them does. It just requires an outcome in 10 years. So the law is set up to give MWA and Cambridge and Somerville and Boston Water and Sewer and Chelsea, the ones involved, each their own opportunity to look at what would work best for them, what would be cost effective, and 10 years to implement it. So it's a recognition that things differ from place to place, and that what will work in one place might not be the best choice in another. So just give us the outcome.
Thank you. And a message came in about the Merrimack River to Bath. Is the Merrimack work focused on the fact that the river is an actual drinking water supply as well?
Yeah, to the extent that we were able to in our analysis, we did consider those communities that use the Merrimack as a drinking water source and compared them to those that don't. And we didn't find a very strong signal, a big difference between them. So at least within the limits of the study that we have, we don't think that is necessarily a very the dominant exposure pathway for people in the Merrimack Valley. So this both has, there are still people who may be more susceptible to illness through contaminated drinking water, people with immune system deficiencies, people who are older, the very young, but we didn't see that in our data. And it also means that this association may be found in other systems where that drinking water, where the contaminated source is not a drinking water source. So there may be more implications for people who are recreating or otherwise living near those water bodies.
Thank you. And I'll just note that in the chat, we've dropped in how to sign up to testify for the bill. So there's instructions there. And then there's also an opportunity to sign the petition to end sewage pollution in Alewife Brook. So both of those are opportunities. And next question. Somebody was asking about who is required and obligated to have and enforce MS4 permits. And then a question just below that about stormwater flooding. So I think the question is around how does stormwater flooding and stormwater management tie into this? And maybe Patrick or Max want to answer that.
I'm sorry, I missed the question because I was typing in the answer to something else. So I'll defer to Max.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm looking for it too. So, okay, what's the connection? So, I mean, it's a really interesting connection. So for people who don't know all the acronyms, MS4 is, it basically means that any stormwater that comes out of a municipal pipe is being regulated as a discharge into the river, just like something that would come out of a wastewater treatment plant or not just like it. But the point being, if you are in the Charles River watershed, and this may apply to other watersheds soon, you have some really specific requirements for nutrient reduction associated with stormwater pipes that are coming from the MS4 system. And a kind of complexity about combined sewer overflow and its interaction with the MS4 permit is that as we separate sewers, we're taking stormwater that would have been going to Deer Island, and now we're putting it into the Charles River. So I think the point that I would make is that sometimes doing sewer separation actually means that you have to do more stormwater treatment. That's what the Alewife constructed wetland is all about. And if you, stay involved with this issue, you'll see that the MWRA has done some calculations showing that, in some cases, doing sewer separation in the area that contributes to the Cottage Farm CSO can actually increase phosphorus loading to the Charles River. So it's not, sewer separation is not a perfect, it is the right solution, but then we still have problems with stormwater pollution. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's a complicated issue.
And I'll add to that just briefly, is to say that during really wet days, combined sewer overflows are a real driver of poor water quality. And for many other days of the year, stormwater is the driver of poor water quality in the river. And so it really points to a shared responsibility among the operators that we're talking about today, who are CSO dischargers, and also some of the neighboring communities to invest and address that stormwater infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Someone writes in, how can environmental chemists help, assuming we can detect and distinguish CSO stormwater on the chemistry side?
Well,
that open to...
I'll take that one briefly, just because we've actually had some interactions at the Herring Run and Paddle, and we think there's a real opportunity as a nonprofit water quality group taking water quality samples to work with Northeastern and better understand some of the other pollutants that are making its way through the combined sewer system into our rivers. I think we all understand the pathogens and the bacterial loads, which we measure frequently. And I think having a partner like our professor here at Northeastern can help us understand the fate of other chemicals that may be emerging out of these combined sewer systems and how long they stay in the system as they move downstream.
Great, thank you. We'll do one more question. Let's see. DEP has been requesting I&I for a long time. Is it making a difference? Anybody want to take that one? Jean?
EPA's been requesting infiltration and inflow reduction for a long time, and I think some communities have been acting in response to that, lining their sewers, things like that. I don't think any of them has found the golden way to do a big reduction in inflow and infiltration at this point, but I think